Hello and welcome. My name is Thomas Kevin Dolan. I'm the writer and author of Little Fag, A Journey of Self-Acceptance and Healing. It's my memoir, actually. And today I'm going to read chapter 8. It's entitled A Restructured Foundation. There's this quirky dynamic that unfolds for me with people I care for most. I call it my backyard syndrome. It's a way to better understand who they are. It's vital for me to visit their home, their backyard, if you will. While falling in love with my soon-to-be husband, I told him I wanted to visit the neighborhood in which he grew up in, his backyard in Taipei. Equally, I wanted to share my backyard experiences with him. A visit to his childhood backyard was my way of energetically knowing him better. Taipei has such an amazing rhythm, a lovely vibe, very similar to the man I love. My husband was very generous with my request. We visited his first home. I loved watching him quietly reminisce as he stared up at what used to be his bedroom. He gifted me with a picture of himself. He was maybe 4 years old. He was chasing after his parents, carrying what looked like a plastic toy sword. I wanted to visit the street that little boy had run along. After a day of visits to places that were clearly responsible for how this amazing man is today, I remember hugging him and feeling I was holding more of the man I woke up with that morning. Conversely, the rhythm and energy in Calgary, my hometown, are palpably different. We lived in what Calgary labels as wartime houses. Many of these houses still stand in older neighborhoods of the city. West Hillhurst was the area the Dolans grew up in. Typically, these old wartime houses have 2 bedrooms. Mom and Dad shared 1 bedroom, and for their 9 children, there were 3 sets of bunk beds in the 2nd bedroom and a single bed in what Mom and Dad called the back shed. There was no central heating, only a furnace in the living room. The windows, which only had single panes of glass, shielded little from Calgary's cold winters and seemed to attract heat during the prairie summers. Ours was a house filled with ghosts, trauma and violent memories, decades-old shouting and disturbances, front yard brawls, 3 a.m. screams of terror and shame. I hadn't thought my husband would want to see my backyard. I stood beside him, gazing up the house, the backdrop to my formative years. Lost in my past, it was all I could do to stand on that street. It's now a daycare center filled with happy children. What I braved. At one point in time, the introduction on my Facebook page included this comment. As a light worker, I am not someone who ignores the darkness. I am someone who transforms the darkness. With my husband beside me, in front of my old backyard, the darkness felt impenetrable. Although the rubble of the wartime house I grew up in had settled decades ago to make room for this large daycare facility, it was still haunting to feel the fear that lived in my cells from the years endured in that place. It was embarrassing to share the strife I'd felt from living in that house. The seedlings I had planted while in grade school were now towering trees. This little boy never played in them. My husband held tight to my hand and invited me to gently breathe. I'm sure at some point in time he whispered, "You are safe now, I've got your back." Did I only have war stories to share? Did I and my siblings really endure the terror of 3 a.m. awakenings caused by drunk adults singing and fighting? It seemed the deeper I breathed, the greater access I had to memories that brought a smile to my face and a sense of pride that I felt proud to share. There were times when it was 40 degrees, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that the 5 youngest of us would play floor hockey in the living room. Sponge hockey pucks had been invented, but not small sticks. Mom told us to use our hands as sticks. Time disappeared on those days. Camping was relegated to the side of the house. I can still smell the aroma of oiled canvas from my waterproofed pup tent. How I longed for my elementary school boy crushes to lay beside me in that tent. There was no room for a dartboard in the house. The fence that my oldest brother built became our board. I laughed, sharing the memory of my younger sister throwing a dart that ended up in the arm of my youngest brother. It was a place that I could find some value for after all. There were lessons received at a young age that formed who I was in my married life with the man beside me. In what was the darkness, even feeling clueless, I could see that it did transform some of it. As we drove away that day, having shared my backyard with my husband, I realized what I braved was acknowledging that where I grew up contributed to who I am. I couldn't run away from that. Yet I did realize that sometimes the running away from it is what helped me to make me who I am today. The unlearning. Invite him over. You two can sleep in the same bed. He's wanting you to call him, taunted one of my siblings. A childhood boy crush of mine wanted to play games with me. All I could think of was whether or not Dad would beat Mom in the wee hours of the morning, and my friend would be there to witness it. During my entire childhood, not one of my friends spent a sleepover at my house. The stakes were too high, the potential shame too devastating. We visited many houses of my mom's friends and a few of my dad's. I loved seeing how others lived. It created this expansive view of life that was never encouraged in the Dolan family. One Christmas, all 5 of us little ones were packed into the back seat of my brother-in-law's Chevy Impala. Mom, my big sister, and her husband filled the front seat. We oohed and awed our way through the Christmas light displays of Calgary's Lake Bonavista neighborhood. We loved it. In between puffs of their cigarettes from the front 3 in the front seat of the car, I struggled to breathe and see past the buildup of condensation on the passenger side window of the back seat. Christmas lights dazzled my imagination. I remember this comment from my mom while my brother-in-law navigated the icy, Christmas-spirited streets. These people, with all their money, are never happy. Fast forward decades, I had no money, I wasn't happy. Through therapy, I had discovered that I had connected having money to not being happy. My therapist helped me discover that the belief I was holding was not mine, it was my mom's. Next up, because I wanted to be happy, was to create a value around prosperity that was my own. I partnered with an amazing woman on Long Beach in New York and began to plow through all my shadows relating to prosperity, mostly the lack of it. She shared and ran a program she created called the Prosperity Project. Growing up on welfare only provided the basics for us as a family, and even then, there were many occasions we'd go without. So this desire to breathe into a greater sense of prosperity came with a lot of baggage. One of the exercises created by my prosperity coach was something called the prosperity game. Here was the point of the game. To receive the full benefits of playing the game, one must become open to, not necessarily accept, but certainly cease resisting the possibility that there is more to our experience of money than meets the eye. It became a game I didn't like to play. An assignment one week was to go off and spend, hypothetically, $1 million. I was miserable. Upon my return to our virtual classroom, my coach asks what it was like to spend $1 million. I chimed in with, "This was the hardest thing I've ever done." I remember her probing. "Tell me more. How did it feel?" "It felt pointless," I shared. My coach quickly chimed in with, "Pointless is not a feeling." Dejected and feeling a bit of shame, I added, "It really felt sad attempting to spend all that money." I heard the universe's chime of ding, ding, ding. "Do you want to dive deeper into that sadness, Thomas?" she asked. With an ache in my stomach, which I'd come to learn was fear, I reluctantly said, "Okay." The unlearning for me was served when my coach asked, "Who taught you that by having money, you wouldn't be happy?" Suddenly, the karmic circle from the Christmas light tour in the 1960s was complete. I often read in the spirit of parenting, because I'm not that, and I'm not going to pretend that I know what it's like to parent. Not for a moment. No, this was a choice in this lifetime for me not to have children. one of the big questions for Adam and I as we fell in love was for me to halt the process at one point in time and say, want to know? Here's a big question for me. And the answer to it is yes or no. Do you want to have children? He took a breath and said no. I said, whew, good. Okay, now we can continue. So it was a match. I digress. What I wanted to share in relation to that was so much of what we were taught as children were the projections of what existed for my parents, particularly my mom. Her projection of happy people having no money was really ingrained in us as kids. All of my siblings, weren't very happy. They didn't have a lot of money. So what I realized I had done as I dove into some therapy work was, so that I was loved and liked by my mom, I would make sure that whatever beliefs she held and taught to me, I would make sure it came true. Because if it didn't come true, the story the little boy in me would make up was that I wouldn't be loved by my mom. So if I had money and I was happy, I wouldn't be loved by mom. If I had no money and I was unhappy, like my mom, I think she might love me. Isn't that wacky? But that's what we do as children, right? We make up stories that are completely disempowering for us, that we listen to in the presence of adults who never functionally explained, because they couldn't, explain what was really going on. So we as children make up stories that are disempowering, and we always make the story about us. So I would begin to understand, part of my work in this lifetime was to unravel those things that had values connected to them that I would discover were running my life, but they weren't my values. It was actually really confusing. And when I first stepped into kind of that arena of unraveling those values for myself, it was really difficult. And yet on the other end, when I could begin to create some semblance of prosperity in my life and see that, and it isn't that money is the only thing that made me happy, but seeing that it certainly made my life different, and it made me begin to believe that the universe was a friendly place, that nobody was out to get me. That was a belief my mom held, which of course I held for the longest point in time. It's why I was reluctant to ask anybody for help. So this chapter helps me remember, first of all of those teachings that weren't formalized, right? Mom didn't say to us, here are these structured things that you're supposed to believe. I just made up stories based on what she said. My job was to undo them. More importantly, my job was to create values that were mine, that could run my life, that weren't connected to teachings from my mom and at times my parents that were a tad wacky, that would never serve me. So more undoing, right? More undoing to set myself free from this really nasty enmeshment and really nasty stories and lessons that ultimately had no foundation to them at all. But remember, no voice. Don't ask questions. Don't be curious. So those stories, those wacky stories, had a tremendous degree of endurance in my life. Of course, until they didn't.